At the family dinner, my daughter-in-law leaned close enough for only me to hear her and whispered, "I'm pregnant with your husband's child." And in that moment, something inside me didn't shatter the way you'd expect. It went completely still. I smiled, the same polite smile I had worn through countless holidays, birthdays, and Sunday meals, and I passed the bowl of mashed potatoes like nothing had happened, like she had just commented on the weather instead of quietly detonating my entire life. The dining room looked exactly as it always did. Warm lighting. The oak table my husband Robert and I had picked out nearly 25 years ago. The faint scent of rosemary chicken lingering in the air, but suddenly, it all felt staged, like a picture of a family rather than a real one. Daniel was laughing about something at the far end of the table, completely unaware, his voice easy and relaxed, while Emily sat back in her chair as if she had simply shared a harmless secret, her expression calm, almost satisfied. I picked up my glass of water, noticing how steady my hand was, which surprised me more than anything else. I should have been shaking. I should have demanded answers. But instead, I took a slow sip and set the glass back down with quiet precision. My husband avoided my eyes. That was the first confirmation. Not the words themselves, not even her tone, but the way Robert suddenly found great interest in his plate, cutting his food into smaller and smaller pieces as if the arrangement of it mattered more than the conversation around him. I watched him carefully, the man I had built a life with, the man I thought I knew better than anyone. And for the first time, I saw something unfamiliar in him, something small and cowardly that had probably always been there, just hidden beneath years of routine and trust. "Margaret, are you okay?" Daniel asked, finally noticing my silence. I turned to him and smiled again, softer this time. "Of course," I said. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. I felt a kind of exhaustion that didn't belong to the body but to something deeper, something that had been quietly carrying this family for decades without ever being acknowledged. Emily reached for her wine glass, her fingers brushing the rim with deliberate care, and I caught the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips, like she was waiting for a reaction, any reaction. But I gave her nothing. I had spent most of my life keeping the peace, smoothing over tension, making sure everyone else was comfortable. Tonight, that instinct didn't disappear, it transformed. Because as I sat there, listening to the clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation, I realized something with absolute clarity. They thought I was fragile. They thought I would fall apart quietly, maybe cry later in the privacy of my bedroom, maybe pretend none of this had happened just to keep the family intact. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked across the table at Emily, meeting her eyes for the first time since she whispered those words, and I gave her a smile that felt different from the others, calm, measured, and completely controlled. She blinked, just once, and in that brief moment, I saw it. Uncertainty. Good. I wasn't going to ask questions tonight. I wasn't going to raise my voice or make a scene. Some truths didn't need to be dragged into the light immediately. Some required patience. And I had learned, over a lifetime of being underestimated, that silence could be far more powerful than anger. I stayed at the table until the very end of the meal, long after the plates had been cleared and the conversation had drifted into comfortable, meaningless topics, the kind people use to fill silence when they do not want to look too closely at what is really happening. Daniel was talking about a project at work, something about deadlines and new clients, his voice steady and confident, while Emily nodded along, as if she had not just placed a secret between us that could unravel everything. Robert excused himself early, claiming he had a headache, which was unusual for him, but not unexpected given what I now understood. I watched him walk out of the room without once glancing back, and that small detail settled into my mind like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. When the evening finally ended and the house grew quiet, I moved slowly through the kitchen, rinsing dishes that were already clean, wiping countertops that did not need wiping, allowing my hands to stay busy while my thoughts arranged themselves into something sharper, something more deliberate. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second sounding louder than it should have, marking the shift from the life I thought I had into something else entirely. I had always believed that if something was wrong in a family, you addressed it directly, you spoke about it, you fixed it together. But as I stood there in the dim light, I realized that belief belonged to a version of reality that no longer existed for me. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was something that had been building quietly, carefully, behind my back, while I continued playing my role without question. I dried my hands on a towel and walked into the living room, where the photographs on the mantel seemed to watch me with a kind of silent judgment. There we were, years ago, smiling at a beach in California, the wind catching my hair, Robert's arm around my shoulders, Daniel still young enough to lean into us without hesitation. I picked up the frame and studied it more closely, noticing details I had overlooked before. The way Robert smiled did not quite reach his eyes, the way I had been looking directly at the camera, unaware of anything beyond that moment. I set the photo back down carefully, aligning it with the others, maintaining the illusion even now. Upstairs, I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards as Robert moved around the bedroom, and I wondered how many nights had passed like this, how many small lies had been told in the quiet spaces between our conversations. I did not go up right away. Instead, I sat down in my armchair, the one near the window, and folded my hands in my lap, letting the stillness settle over me. Anger would have been easier. Tears would have been expected. But what I felt was something colder, something that did not rush or burn, but instead spread slowly, like a thin layer of ice forming over water. I began to think back over the past year, replaying moments that had once seemed insignificant. The late nights Robert could not quite explain. The way Emily had started coming by more often, always with a reason that sounded reasonable on its own, but felt different now when placed alongside everything else. The way Daniel had grown used to her absence at times, brushing it off, without concern. Each memory shifted, changed shape, revealing something I had not been willing to see before. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to focus, to gather everything into a single, clear understanding. This was not just betrayal. It was calculation. And if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that you did not confront calculation with emotion. You responded with patience. I opened my eyes and looked around the room one more time, taking in every detail, every piece of a life I had built, and I made a quiet decision that felt as solid as the ground beneath me. I would not ask them for the truth. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I would watch. I would listen. And when the time was right, I would act in a way they would never expect. The next morning began like any other, which felt almost insulting in its normalcy, as if the world had decided that nothing of importance had changed while I knew everything had. I woke before Robert, as I usually did, and made my way downstairs, the hardwood floor cool beneath my feet, the house quiet in a way that now felt different, heavier somehow. I brewed coffee and stood by the kitchen counter, watching the steam rise slowly from the mug, letting the routine ground me while my thoughts stayed sharp and alert. When Robert finally came down, he paused for just a fraction of a second when he saw me already there, and that hesitation did not escape me. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, too casual, like someone rehearsing a line they had said many times before. "Morning," I replied, turning slightly to face him, studying the way he avoided direct eye contact, the way his hand lingered on the back of the chair before he sat down. I poured him a cup of coffee without asking, just as I had done for years, placing it in front of him with the same quiet precision. He thanked me, but his tone lacked its usual warmth, and I noticed how quickly he reached for his phone, as if it could provide him with an escape from the room. We spoke about ordinary things, the weather, a neighbor's new fence, an upcoming bill that needed to be paid, and I matched his rhythm perfectly, offering responses that sounded natural while observing every detail. There was a distance between us now that had not been there before, not because of what I felt, but because I could see clearly for the first time how long he had already been somewhere else. Later that afternoon, Emily stopped by unannounced, which she had started doing more frequently over the past several months, though I had not questioned it at the time. She walked in with her usual confidence, carrying a small bag of groceries, as if she were simply being thoughtful, as if this house was just another place she belonged without condition. "I thought I would bring a few things for dinner," she said lightly, setting the bag on the counter. I nodded, watching her movements closely, noticing how comfortable she seemed, how easily she navigated the space, opening cabinets without hesitation, reaching for utensils as though she had memorized their placement. "That is kind of you," I said, my voice steady, my expression calm. She glanced at me then, just briefly, and I caught it again, that flicker of something behind her eyes, a question, a test, as if she were trying to determine whether I had changed since the night before. I had not, at least not in any way she could see. "Daniel is working late," she added, almost casually, though the timing of that information felt deliberate. I gave a small nod, filing it away without comment. As she moved around the kitchen, I noticed how often she checked her phone, how quickly she turned the screen away from me when a message appeared, and how a faint smile would cross her lips before she tucked the device back into her pocket. It was subtle, but now that I was paying attention, it was impossible to ignore. Robert came in shortly after, and for a moment, the three of us stood in the same room. A perfectly ordinary scene to anyone looking from the outside, yet filled with undercurrents that only I seemed to fully understand. Their interaction was careful, almost too careful, lacking the natural ease that should have existed if there were nothing to hide. They did not stand too close, did not speak in tones that could be considered inappropriate, but there was something in the timing of their movements, the way their eyes met and then quickly shifted away, that confirmed everything without a single word being spoken. I turned back to the sink and continued rinsing vegetables, my hands steady, my breathing even, allowing them to believe that their secret remained intact. But inside, each observation settled into place, building something methodical and precise. I was no longer searching for answers. I was collecting them. I did not sleep much that night, but I did not feel tired either, as if something inside me had shifted from rest to readiness, like a switch quietly flipped with no intention of ever turning back. The next few days unfolded with a strange clarity, each moment sharper than it had been before, each detail easier to notice now that I was no longer distracted by trust. I began to revisit the past in my mind, not with nostalgia, but with precision, as though I were re-examining evidence that had always been there, waiting for me to finally understand it. 40 years of marriage is not something that disappears in a single whisper, and yet, when I looked closely, I could see the cracks that had formed long before that night at the dinner table. Robert had always been dependable, steady in a way that felt safe, but now I began to question whether that steadiness had been real or simply convenient. I remembered the first time he stayed late at the office more than usual, how he had come home with a vague explanation and a tired smile that I accepted without question. I remembered how often he had started checking his phone during dinner, how easily he dismissed it as work, how I chose to believe him because believing him required less effort than doubting him. And then there was Emily. When Daniel first introduced her, I had welcomed her without hesitation, grateful that my son had found someone he cared about, someone who seemed attentive and thoughtful. She had asked me questions about the family, about our traditions, about the way things were done in this house, and I had answered them all openly, never imagining that I was giving her a map instead of a welcome. Over time, she became more present, more involved, offering to help with meals, stopping by with small gifts, inserting herself into routines that had once belonged to me alone. At the time, I saw it as kindness, as an effort to connect, but now, when I replayed those moments, I saw something else beneath the surface, something calculated and patient. She had learned everything she needed to know, not just about the house, but about us, about me. I stood in the hallway one afternoon, looking at the closed door of the study, the room where Robert spent most of his evenings, and I realized how rarely I had questioned what happened behind it. I had trusted that space, respected it even, believing it was his place to think, to work, to unwind. Now, it felt like a boundary I had never been invited to cross. I walked past it without stopping, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I understood that rushing would only lead to mistakes. Whatever had been happening had not begun overnight, which meant I could not afford to act as if it had. Later that day, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with an old photo album open in front of me, turning pages slowly, carefully, as if the images might shift if I moved too quickly. There was Daniel as a child, smiling with a kind of openness that no longer existed. There was Robert standing beside me at a holiday gathering, his hand resting on my shoulder in a way that once felt reassuring. I traced the edge of one photograph with my finger, noticing how composed everything looked, how complete it seemed, and I understood then that appearances had always been part of our lives, just not in the way I had assumed. I closed the album gently and sat there for a long moment, letting the silence settle around me. This was not just about betrayal. It was about time, about years of small choices and quiet omissions that had led us here. And as I sat there, I felt something settle into place within me. Not anger, not grief, but a kind of calm understanding that came with seeing the full picture for the first time. I had given my trust freely, without condition, and they had used that trust to build something behind my back. That realization did not break me. It clarified everything. Because if they had taken the time to construct this carefully, then I would take the time to dismantle it just as precisely. I did not need to search for proof for very long, because once I allowed myself to see clearly, the evidence stopped hiding. It revealed itself in ordinary places, in the quiet gaps between what was said and what was avoided. That afternoon, while Emily stood at the kitchen counter slicing vegetables with practiced ease, I noticed her phone light up again, the screen briefly reflecting in the polished surface of the marble. She turned it away quickly, but not before I caught a single word in the preview of the message, a name that did not belong to Daniel. Robert. It was enough. Not confirmation in the dramatic sense, not something that could be held up and declared to the world, but enough to remove the last layer of doubt that might have softened my resolve. I continued rinsing the dishes, letting the water run over my hands a little longer than necessary, as if the repetition could anchor me to the moment without exposing what I now knew. Emily moved closer to place something in the refrigerator, her presence just behind my shoulder, her movements calm, unhurried, as though she had nothing to conceal. "You always keep everything so organized," she said lightly, her tone almost admiring. I turned my head slightly and gave a small nod. "It helps when you know where everything belongs," I replied, my voice even, my words carrying a meaning she could not quite place. She paused for a fraction of a second, then smiled and stepped away, returning to her task as if nothing had shifted. But something had. Later, when she left, I watched from the living room window as she walked to her car, her posture confident, her steps measured, not once looking back at the house she had quietly learned to move through as if it were her own. When Robert came in that evening, he carried the same air of practiced normalcy, placing his keys in the same spot, asking the same routine questions, unaware that I was no longer answering them in the same way. "Did Emily stop by?" he asked, casually, as he loosened his tie. I met his eyes for just a moment before turning back to the stove. "Yes," I said. "She did." I did not elaborate, and he did not ask. That silence between us stretched, thin, but undeniable, and I could feel him hesitate, as if deciding whether to say more, whether to test the boundaries of what I knew. He chose not to. That choice told me more than any confession could have. After dinner, he retreated to the study again, closing the door behind him with a softness that once felt considerate but now seemed deliberate. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. Then I moved quietly down the hallway, stopping just short of the door, not close enough to be obvious, but near enough to hear the faint murmur of his voice. It was low, careful, almost rehearsed, the kind of tone a person uses when they believe they are speaking privately. I did not need to hear the words clearly. The rhythm was enough. The pauses, the softness, the familiarity. It was not the voice of a man discussing business. It was something else entirely, something that confirmed what had already taken shape in my mind. I stepped back before he could open the door, returning to the living room with the same calm steps, sitting down in my chair as if I had never moved. When he emerged a few minutes later, he found me exactly where he expected me to be, composed, quiet, predictable. "I am going to turn in early," he said, avoiding my gaze again. I nodded without looking up. "Of course." And just like that, the evening ended. But the truth did not feel heavy anymore. It felt precise, measured. I no longer wondered if it was real. I no longer questioned what I had heard at the dinner table. I had seen enough. Not everything, not yet, but enough to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. And that understanding changed everything. Because now, I was no longer reacting to a possibility. I was preparing for a certainty. Once I understood that the truth was no longer something I needed to chase, I allowed myself to slow down even more, to move through each day with the same familiar rhythm while quietly shifting my intentions beneath the surface. I did not confront Robert. I did not question Emily. Instead, I became more attentive, more present in ways that appeared ordinary but served a different purpose entirely. I began to notice patterns, not just isolated moments, but the structure of their behavior, the timing of their interactions. The way certain days seemed to carry an unspoken tension while others passed too smoothly, almost as if they were compensating for something. Robert started leaving the house earlier than usual on certain mornings, always with a reason that sounded practical: meetings, errands, small obligations that required his attention. Emily's visits became more frequent on those same days, though never announced in advance, always explained as coincidence. I welcomed her each time with the same calm politeness, offering coffee, asking simple questions, maintaining the version of myself they both expected to see. But internally, I was no longer participating in the life they believed we shared. I was observing it. One afternoon, while Emily stepped outside to take a call, I remained by the window, watching her reflection in the glass rather than looking directly at her. Her posture changed when she thought she was alone, her shoulders relaxing, her expression softening into something more genuine, more revealing. She smiled in a way I had never seen directed at Daniel, a quiet, knowing smile that confirmed more than any words could. When she came back inside, she resumed her usual demeanor without hesitation, slipping back into her role as if nothing had shifted. I responded in kind, nodding as she spoke, asking a question about something insignificant, allowing her to believe that the performance was still necessary. That evening, after she left, I went upstairs and opened the closet where I kept our financial records, something I had always managed but rarely revisited in detail. I pulled out the folders one by one, placing them neatly on the bed, reviewing documents that had once felt routine but now carried a different weight. Bank statements, property records, insurance policies, everything that defined the structure of our shared life. I was not looking for something specific at first, only familiarizing myself again with what existed, what was mine, what could be moved, protected, or redefined. The numbers did not lie. They never had. And unlike people, they did not change based on convenience or desire. I sat there for a long time, reading through each page carefully, making quiet notes in my mind, building an understanding that was no longer emotional but strategic. When Robert came into the room later that night, he paused when he saw the papers spread out before me. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone light, but edged with something else, something closer to caution. I looked up at him and offered a small, reassuring smile. "Just organizing things," I said. "It has been a while." He nodded slowly, as if accepting the explanation, but I noticed how his eyes lingered on the documents, how his posture stiffened ever so slightly before he turned away. That reaction was important, not because it confirmed anything new, but because it revealed his awareness, his understanding that there were parts of our life he could not fully control. I gathered the papers neatly and returned them to their place, closing the closet door with quiet care. I was not rushing. I was not reacting. I was preparing. And for the first time since that night at the dinner table, I felt something steady settle within me. Not pain, not anger, but a quiet sense of direction. Because now, I knew exactly where to look, and more importantly, I knew exactly what to protect. By the end of that week, I had stopped seeing the house as a place of comfort and started seeing it as a structure of information, every room holding something that mattered, every routine revealing something that could be used. I no longer moved through it absent-mindedly. I moved with intention. One morning, after Robert left earlier than usual, I waited exactly 10 minutes before picking up my purse and heading out myself, not in a rush, not with hesitation, but with the same calm pace I had maintained through everything else. The law office was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that suggested order, discretion, and control, and I appreciated that immediately. I had made the appointment under the simplest pretense, a routine review, something any woman my age might reasonably decide to do after years of managing a household. When I sat across from the attorney, I did not begin with emotion. I did not mention betrayal or suspicion. I spoke in clear, measured terms about assets, about ownership, about what belonged to me, and what could be protected if circumstances changed. He listened carefully, asking precise questions, taking notes in a way that mirrored my own approach, steady, methodical, without unnecessary reaction. As we spoke, I began to see the structure of my life in a different way, not as something shared equally, but as something that could be divided, redirected, secured. The house, the accounts, the investments, each piece could be adjusted, not drastically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough to ensure that control rested where it needed to. I left the office with a folder that looked ordinary to anyone else. Thin, unremarkable, but inside it held the beginning of a shift that neither Robert nor Emily would anticipate. When I returned home, everything appeared exactly as I had left it. The same quiet rooms, the same neatly arranged furniture, the same illusion of stability. I placed the folder in the bottom drawer of my dresser, beneath items no one else ever touched, and closed it with the same care I had used when opening it. That afternoon, Emily stopped by again, her timing as consistent as ever, her smile just as practiced. "I was in the area," she said lightly, setting her bag down as if the explanation required no further detail. I nodded, offering her tea, watching as she moved through the kitchen with that same familiarity, that same quiet confidence. "Daniel mentioned you have been organizing things lately," she added, her tone casual, but her eyes sharper now, searching for something beneath the surface. I met her gaze briefly and smiled. "It is something I should have done a long time ago," I said. "It feels good to have everything in order." She held my gaze for a second longer than usual, then looked away, as if deciding whether to press further. She did not. Instead, she changed the subject, speaking about something trivial, something designed to re-establish normalcy. I allowed it. That evening, when Robert returned, I noticed the same subtle tension in him, the same awareness that something had shifted, though he could not yet define it. "You have been busy lately," he said, watching me as I set the table. I placed the plates down evenly, aligning them with quiet precision before responding. "Just taking care of things," I said. He nodded slowly, as if accepting the answer, but I could see the question remain behind his eyes. "Good. Let it remain. Let it grow." Because uncertainty, I had learned, was far more unsettling than truth. I sat down across from him, folding my hands lightly in front of me, and for a brief moment, the room felt perfectly still, like the calm before something inevitable. I did not need to confront them. I did not need to expose anything yet. What I needed was time, and I was already using it. Every document reviewed, every account understood, every small adjustment made quietly in the background brought me closer to a position they would never see coming. They believed they were in control because they held a secret. But secrets only hold power when the truth is unknown. And now, the truth belonged to me. The following week, I suggested we have dinner together again. All of us, something simple, something familiar, and no one questioned it. Daniel seemed pleased by the idea, mentioning how it had been a while since we all sat down without distractions, while Emily agreed a little too quickly, her smile measured, her eyes briefly searching my face for something she could not quite identify. Robert said very little, only nodding once as if the decision required no discussion, but I noticed the way his shoulders tightened ever so slightly, the way his gaze lingered on me for a fraction longer than usual. That evening, I set the table with the same care I always had, placing each plate, each glass, each folded napkin with deliberate precision, not out of habit, but because details mattered now more than ever. The house looked warm, inviting, unchanged, and that was exactly what I wanted. When they arrived, everything unfolded exactly as expected. Coats were hung, polite greetings exchanged, the soft hum of conversation filling the space as if nothing had ever been broken beneath the surface. I moved through the kitchen and dining room with quiet ease, serving dishes, refilling glasses, listening more than speaking, allowing them to settle into a sense of comfort they believed was real. Emily sat across from me, her posture relaxed, her movements confident, while Robert avoided my eyes more carefully than before, as if he had begun to sense that something was no longer aligned in the way he understood. Daniel, unaware of everything, carried the conversation forward, talking about work, about plans, about things that belonged to a world that no longer included the truth sitting silently between us. I waited. I let the meal progress naturally, let the rhythm build, let them believe that this was just another evening, another performance they had successfully maintained. When the plates were nearly empty and the conversation slowed, I set my fork down gently and reached for the glass of water beside me, taking a small sip before placing it back with the same quiet control. Then I looked up, not at Robert, not at Daniel, at Emily. She met my gaze, her expression steady at first, but I saw it again, that flicker of uncertainty, that brief hesitation that told me she was not as certain as she wanted to appear. "I spent some time last week reviewing our financial records," I said calmly, my voice even, carrying just enough weight to shift the room without breaking it. Robert's hand stilled. Daniel looked up, confused but attentive. Emily did not move. "It has been a long time since I looked at everything in detail," I continued, folding my hands lightly in front of me. "And I realized there were a few changes I needed to make." I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I simply let the words settle, one by one, watching as the meaning began to form in their minds before I even finished speaking. "Ownership structures, account access, beneficiary designations," I said, each phrase precise, deliberate, impossible to misunderstand for anyone who knew what they were listening for. Robert shifted in his chair, his composure beginning to fracture at the edges. "Margaret, what are you talking about?" he asked, attempting to keep his tone steady, but the strain was there now, visible, undeniable. I turned my head slightly, meeting his eyes at last. "I am talking about clarity," I said. "Something I should have prioritized a long time ago." Emily's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, a small movement, but enough. Daniel looked between us, his confusion deepening, his expression searching for context that no one had given him. I let the silence stretch just a little longer before I spoke again. Not louder, not harsher, just clearer. "Everything is in order now," I said. "Exactly where it belongs." And in that moment, I saw it happen. The shift, the realization. Not fully formed yet, not spoken, but present. They had believed they were managing a secret. They had believed they were in control of something hidden. But now, sitting at that table, with nothing more than a few carefully chosen words, I had changed the balance without ever revealing the truth they thought they owned. And that was the beginning of the end for them, even if they did not understand it yet. The silence that followed did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like something fragile being tested from every angle, each of them trying to understand what had just happened without asking the question directly. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice uncertain, searching for ground that no longer felt stable. "What kind of changes?" he asked, glancing between Robert and me, unaware that the answer he was looking for was not meant for him, not yet. I turned slightly toward him, softening my expression just enough to keep him at ease. "Just practical things," I said. "The kind you take care of when you realize you have been putting them off for too long." He nodded, though the confusion did not leave his face, and I could see him trying to accept that explanation because it was the only one available. Robert did not speak. He sat there, his posture more rigid than before, his mind moving faster now. I could tell, trying to calculate what I knew, what I had done, and what it meant for him. Emily remained quiet as well, but her stillness was different. It was no longer confident. It was cautious. The rest of the evening ended without incident, at least on the surface. Plates were cleared, polite goodbyes exchanged, and one by one, they stepped back into the version of reality they had been maintaining, though it no longer fit as easily as it once had. When the door closed behind them and the house returned to its familiar quiet, I did not rush to clean up. I stood there for a moment, looking at the table, at the empty chairs, at the small details that had witnessed everything without ever reacting. Then I moved slowly, deliberately, gathering the dishes, placing them in the sink, wiping the table with the same care I had always shown, not because it mattered in the way it used to, but because I chose to remain consistent in who I was, even as everything around me shifted. Upstairs, I could hear Robert moving again, his steps less steady now, his presence more uncertain within the walls he once moved through without hesitation. I did not join him. Instead, I walked into the living room and sat down in my chair, the same place where I had first begun to see things clearly, and I allowed myself to reflect, not on what I had lost, but on what I had regained. Control, clarity, direction. The truth had not destroyed me. It had refined me. Over the next few days, the changes I had set in motion began to settle into place quietly, without announcement, without confrontation. Accounts were adjusted, permissions updated, structures realigned in ways that were entirely legal, entirely deliberate, and entirely beyond their awareness until it was too late to influence. Robert grew more attentive, asking small questions, offering gestures that might have seemed thoughtful under different circumstances, but now felt like attempts to measure the distance between us. I answered him with the same calm consistency, giving nothing away, allowing him to remain uncertain. Emily's visits became less frequent, her confidence no longer as steady, her eyes carrying a trace of something new each time she looked at me. Doubt. And Daniel remained where he had always been, on the surface of everything, unaware of the deeper currents that had already reshaped the foundation beneath him. I did not expose them. I did not need to. Exposure would have been loud, chaotic, temporary. What I had chosen instead was permanent. And one morning, as I stood by the window with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the light settle over the yard, I realized that the life I had once believed was mine had quietly transformed into something else, something stronger, something entirely under my control. I did not feel the need to confront them or to demand explanations. Some truths did not require acknowledgement to hold their power. I set the cup down gently, straightened the edge of the curtain, and turned away from the window without looking back. They believed they had rewritten my story in a whisper. They were wrong. I had simply chosen to finish it myself.